Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today we're going to be talking about what's the Audit Committee's role in deterring fraud. And joining me to talk about this important topic is Don Keller, who's a partner with PwC Center for Board Governance. Don, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, TK. Pleasure to be here.
So I think the best place for us to start is sort of lay a foundation in this deterring fraud. So let's start with what are the standards for deterring fraud in the U.S.?
Well, TK, as you know, the federal sentencing guidelines provide the platform for fraud deterrence and for fraud enforcement here in the United States or for United States companies. There are other promulgations by other nations, UK Bribery Act, et cetera, but here in the U.S., the federal sentencing guidelines require companies to promote a culture that embraces ethical conduct and a commitment to compliance. And of course, boards are required to oversee that standard relative to the companies that they're involved in. I think it is really important for directors to not underestimate the power that they have relative to culture, tone within their companies. May seem a difficult concept for a board member to become involved in and actually have an impact on, but I think by virtue of doing certain things, they truly can impact the culture, the tone, and the behavior of the employees of the company.
Yeah, I'm always surprised, and maybe 2 or 3 years ago, maybe it was even a little longer, we did a study and we asked the question of the board members, how many of them understood the federal sentencing guidelines? And it was less than half, okay, that understood that. And that surprised me because there was a lot of publicity around this, 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm sure the corporate secretaries understand that, but I was a little surprised that more of the board didn't understand that.
That's a fair comment, and I think it's imperative that directors have a basic understanding of how those guidelines work. But I'll reiterate, I also think it's important for them not to underestimate the impact they can have on deterring fraud in their companies. If I were a director and I were allowed only one single metric, it would have something to do with corporate culture in terms of evaluating what was going on inside the company. Sometimes difficult to ascertain that when you are a board member and director just on the outside overseeing the company itself.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit further because I think that gets into what's the audit committee's role, okay, with respect specifically to deterring fraud. And there is a responsibility to understand the tone at the top. I think we both feel that culture plays a huge role in how people make decisions throughout the organization. So what can the audit committee really do, though, in relationship to, other than understanding that, how can they make an influence on a company?
Well, there have been a number of studies done by various universities, the SEC, et cetera, that clearly indicate that employees look to the CEO to set the tone of the company. In fact, about 98% of the respondents indicate that the CEO sets the tone. And just working with that information, the board needs to understand that by virtue of asking questions of the CEO, of the C-suite, of the management team, that they can gain a lot of insight into what is going on, but furthermore, they can actually shape behavior. because what happens after a board meeting, if you're on the inside of the company, what you see are everyone scrambles out of the boardrooms and they go caucus and they say they're interested in this, they're interested in that, and it actually, what's discussed in the boardroom drives behavior within the company. And if in fact you're focused as a director on issues about deterring fraud, it certainly can drive and influence the behavior of these highly influential CEOs. There are a number of ways to try and get to the bottom of what is the tone at the top, what is the culture within the company. I think one of those is exit interviews, particularly of finance personnel who are leaving the company, and does HR have anything to report? I'll tell you, I was involved in another very large investigation where the audit committee chair after the investigation said, "Don, why didn't you tell us that our controller was a monster?" And in fact, during that investigation, they had looked at the 360-degree feedback of that individual, and it was the worst in the history of the company. And my comment to the audit committee chair was, well, I as an external auditor certainly did not go around looking at internal HR files and looking at 360-degree feedback, but perhaps if you as an audit committee member were to inquire of HR about that type of feedback, was there anything unusual that was identified in that process, that might give you some insight relative to what the culture, the tone of the company was. So the CEO obviously plays a critical role. There are employee surveys, employee satisfaction, another tool where if the audit committee is made aware of the responses to the employee surveys with carefully crafted questions, they can gain insight into what's going on in the boardroom. Obviously, leveraging internal and external auditor relationships, private sessions, whereby they can get a feel for perhaps insights that those parties may have relative to culture, to tone. I would also mention the notion of observing how the conduct in the boardroom transpires. Is it highly scripted, tight-fisted, whereby various members of management are reluctant to volunteer responses in an interactive and conversational manner? On the other hand, if you have a lot of free flow of information, then perhaps things are less tightly controlled, less scripted, and maybe an indication of sort of the culture and the tone that is established at the top of the company. It's interesting, we surveyed directors about how many of them actually were getting information regarding exit interviews, employee satisfaction, 360-degree feedback, peer feedback, and had discussions of tone at the top. And we started 3-4 years ago, and directionally over the course of those 3 or 4 years, more and more companies have adopted some of the recommendations that we've made relative to actions that boards can take to actually inquire about information, which in turn then drives behavior of the C-suite and sets tone within the company.
So we have about 2 minutes left, but I wanted to make sure that I asked you about the other director considerations related to the fraud environment.
Fair enough, TK. I would mention that fraud often gets buried in an international location, and that if practicable, if a company could actually rotate CFOs at international locations once every 3 or 4 years, that would lead to the detection and the discouragement of fraud in some of those international locations. Bribery and corruption, a story unto itself. In 2012, every bribery and corruption action on the part of the DOJ and the SEC involved a third party. Tremendous risk relative to third parties on the bribery and corruption front. Agents, resellers, and distributors, and under the federal sentencing guidelines, companies are responsible for those actors in their value chain. So it's incredibly important that boards be familiar with the low-hanging fruit of bribery and corruption issues that can arise across the company, different cultures around the globe, different standards for ethical behavior, et cetera. A huge challenge for boards, and that's an area that I would specifically concentrate on. I would also mention insider trading, which would include expert networks may want to consider a policy to ban employees from participating in expert networks, which are research firms, about 25 of them that actually conduct research and solicit employee input, your employees' input, if you're not precluding that type of behavior. And lastly, insider trading, 10b-25 plans, and some of the criticisms that have been focused on 10b-25 plans. Do you have overlapping plans? Do you allow for easy termination modification? Do you allow adoption in other than normal trading windows? Do you have a 30 to 60 day standoff period? A variety of things to think about relative to preventing the potential for insider trading and the quality of your insider trading plans. That would also include having designated broker only security sales and even general counsel approving all insider trades.
So I want to just add to that the importance of the directors making sure that that is clear in the minutes the steps that they've taken, whether it's FCPA, regardless of what it is, because during the sentencing guidelines, one of the tests is how active has the board been in making sure processes are in place, and that, so good minutes always help with that. So, well, Don, listen, thank you again for joining us, and we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me, TK.
And that will conclude another edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic to help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.